Hello everyone, Professor Wolf here. I'm making this video for students in my Dante class at College DuPage in spring 2026. We just started the third main part of Dante's comedy, Paradiso, and boy is it difficult. I've read this poem a number of times, and it's been a couple years since I've gone through Paradiso, and going through the first few contests last night, wow. All right, so what I want to do in this video is provide you with some helpful background specifically on Dante's astronomy and physics. Well, why these topics, you may ask? As it turns out, the whole of the Paradiso is structured, and in fact heavily structured, by Dante's astronomy, to which his physics is relevant. Now, we are using the Hollander and Hollander version of the comedy. The translation is by Jean Hollander, the commentary is by Robert Hollander, and the commentary is rich and very, very helpful. I think this is especially true for Paradiso, hence the greater size of the Paradiso volume. It's quite a bit bigger than the Purgatorio and Inferno volumes, right? It also has a nice introduction at the beginning. And if you read the introduction, as I'm hoping you all will, you'll get some background on Dante's astronomy and physics. And when you're reading through Hollander's comments, his commentary on the first few cantos and subsequent cantos of Paradiso, you'll find a lot of detail about Dante's astronomy and physics. I'm also sending you some pages from Singleton's commentary on Paradiso to help you out. And I'll probably send you some other resources along the way as well. So we're covered, right? Well, I think it's still easy to get lost in the first few cantos of Paradiso, even with that help. So what I want to do in this video is cover some basics, all right? Now, before I do, a few preliminary remarks are in order, specifically as regards Dante's sources for all this, but also the terms astronomy and physics themselves. So let's start with the terms, and we'll take astronomy first, okay? So as it turns out, historians of science, many of them at least, tell us that when it comes to the ancient period, the medieval period, and at least some of the early modern period, for at least some early modern thinkers, we cannot draw a neat, nice, clean line between what we call astronomy and what we call astrology. These things are complicated, of course. We can expect different definitions of these things today. And these historians aren't saying that ancient, medieval, and early modern thinkers in no way whatsoever had any sense of any kind of distinction between astronomy and astrology. However, they argue that by and large, these things were heavily blended together. You could look at great ancient astronomers such as Ptolemy, who, if my recollection serves correct, was actually fairly critical of some aspects of astrology, but fully embraced others and integrated astrology and astronomy, or at least understood them to be integrated to a very high degree. We can find some architects of the scientific revolution that still view astronomy and astrology as being integrated and being real. Okay, so what do we do then? What terms should we use? Well, we have historians of science saying perhaps we shouldn't talk about astronomy and astrology at all during these times, but we should perhaps use instead terms such as astral science. That's fine, but I just know I myself would have difficulty sticking to that in this video. So I'm going to just continue to talk about Dante's astronomy. However, we should keep in mind that Dante does not understand astronomy in a pure scientific way as we often do today, and that astral forces are integrated into his astronomy. He does have an astral science. We saw this hints of this back in Inferno, certainly in Purgatorio, and we're going to see more and more in Paradiso, right? Dante understands the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars to have significant influence on the earth and on our own psychologies. Now, of course, in modern science, the teaching is not that what happens in space has no impact at all on what happens on the earth. You know, it's light outside right now. That's because of the sun. The sun is outside the earth, sheds light on the earth. We have, you know, the tides due to the moon together with gravity. So the idea of modern science is not that what happens in space has absolutely no impact on what happens on the earth. And I have no idea what contemporary science has to say about the impacts of what happens in space on our own psychologies. I imagine maybe there's some kind of effects of some kind, but we're not looking at anything like full-blown astrology, and certainly not in anything like its traditional forms, right? That's just not at all scientific, right? I should say it's difficult, at least for me, to work out Dante's view on all this, because if I say to you that Dante doesn't have a nice, clean, neat distinction between astronomy and astrology, well, that doesn't necessarily mean he's out there with tarot cards, right? Actually, I've never really had the opportunity yet to explore in more detail how exactly Dante conceives these so-called astral forces on our psychologies, on our choices, on our actions, on our lives, right? And so I don't want to speculate about that at all. I don't think there's a whole lot of hints about it in the comedy. And honestly, I'm not sure if scholars can really work out the details of that much at all. I mean, for all I know, Dante would have strongly rejected, you know, a lot of what today we tend to associate with astrology, right? I'm not so sure what his specific views are on this. You know, maybe he just has this general sense that, you know, what happens in space has an impact on Earth. Again, you know, I mean, he did not understand gravity. He did not, you know, attribute the tides to the force of gravity. But I mean, he knew, you know, he knew that like light hits the Earth from outer space, right? And my sense is a lot of ancient and medieval and early modern folks, you know, they thought, and it made sense to think that things happening out in space could impact, you know, not just the growth of plants, and hey, we need sunlight too, but could even have an impact on our psychologies in some way. And maybe Dante's not really sure what the mechanism is of that. But you know, one thing Dante, we've seen, wants to affirm, in Purgatorio, we're going to see again in Paradiso, is that even though these astral forces do have impact for Dante on our psychologies, our personalities, it's not total, and we do still have free will, right? That's his view. And again, I'm not aware of any evidence showing that Dante approved in any way of horoscope practices or anything that might have been prevalent in his own time. I don't know what such practices were prevalent in his own time. I also don't have evidence he disapproved of it. I can't really speak to that, right? It might actually be, in some ways, his thinking is a lot closer to ours, right, than we might expect. That's really all I can say about it. Okay, so we'll just keep that in mind. Also, as regard physics, Dante's physics is obviously not our physics, right? So really briefly, and here we can get into the sources, Dante for all this. Where is Dante getting all this physics? Where is he getting this astronomy? Well, main sources include Aristotle. Okay, there's also influence from Plato here, right? At least Dante shows awareness of Plato. At Dante's time, pretty much all of Aristotle that we have today had been translated into Latin. Dante had access to pretty much all of that. As far as I'm aware, when it came to Plato, he might have only had access to a partial translation of the Timaeus, but he did, you know, have access to ancient authors writing in Latin, such as Cicero and Augustine, who talked about Plato. So his knowledge of Plato wasn't just confined to that one partial translation of the Timaeus. There's other ancient authors, ancient texts. One you might find really interesting to go explore is, Macrobius's commentary on Cicero's Dream of Scipio. You can go check that out. Muslim commentators on Aristotle's physics and Aristotle's astronomy, right? So these are all sources that Aristotle's got, ancient and medieval, for physics and for astronomy. My understanding is that when it comes to the physics part for Dante, this is probably largely coming out of Aristotle's physics. With I don't know how much his interpretation of that had been shaped by other ancient and medieval authors. When it comes to astronomy, Dante's astronomy is certainly strongly shaped by Aristotle's astronomy, but also the work of Ptolemy, a great ancient astronomer, astral scientist, if you want to call him that, often regarded as the greatest astronomer of the ancient period. I think he was born about the year 100 and died about the year 170, just massively influential. Ptolemy. By the way, I'll put these names in the description for the video so you can look these up. The Muslim commentators on Aristotle, many of whom, all of whom perhaps were also influenced by Neoplatonic texts and traditions, those certainly shaped Dante's understanding of astronomy to a very, very great degree. So there's no question at all that Dante's understanding of astronomy is rooted in Aristotle and Ptolemy, shaped greatly by Muslim commentators. When it comes to the physics, I'm not so sure how much influence later ancient and medieval, including Muslim commentators, really had in his understanding of the physics. Let's go a little more into Aristotle's physics. So Aristotle wrote all sorts of works, right? We know that a number of them did not survive. We know that today the works we have of Aristotle's are not the only works that he produced. Many scholars believe that the works we have of Aristotle were maybe not even intended for publication. Maybe they were lecture notes, private notes of his that he produced. And these texts, as far as I'm aware, we don't think any of them really came down to us with names attached to them that were given by Aristotle. In other words, it's not that Aristotle gave these works names, but later scholars did, right? And one major work by Aristotle we call in English the Physics. Now, this word physics comes from an ancient Greek word physis, meaning nature, and there were thinkers before Aristotle who had written works with titles such as On Physis, on nature. So it's actually not totally inconceivable, I guess, that Aristotle, would have actually given that name to this work that we call the Physics. It's basically a work on nature. All right, but again, it's not physics, chemistry, biology as we tend to think of it today, but it does touch on a lot of topics that are touched on by our physics, chemistry, and biology. And it's very common to hear scholars talk about Aristotle's physics and chemistry and biology. But anyhow, Aristotle's physics covers a whole range of topics. But one thing that it covers in particular that's really important for us is the structure of matter. The structure of matter. So there were different views about this in ancient Greece and in ancient India and other places, right? For example, before Aristotle, there were a number of folks that were atomists. They believed that everything around us is composed out of atoms. Those atoms are not atoms as we tend to think of them today. They didn't know about protons and neutrons and electrons and strong, weak nuclear forces and this kind of thing. They viewed these atoms as, basically the word means uncuttable. So they viewed them as uncuttables. They were objects that you couldn't cut up, you couldn't slice up, you couldn't dice up, right? At least some ancient atomists actually thought in principle atoms could be very, very large. Right. It wasn't really their size really that made them atoms so much as the fact that they were uncuttable. Okay. But many atoms on this view, ancient atomism, which came in different forms, many of these atoms are small, microscopic. That's too small to see with the naked eye. And the idea for these ancient atomists is these atoms made up everything around us, and that you could explain, for example, why flowers behave the way they do. Different flowers behave in different ways, but more similarly to one another than what you see with a squirrel. Why a wooden table behaves the way it does. Why a stone table behaves the way it does. That you could explain how these things come to be. How they they eventually fall apart, how they behave, how they respond to different external influences. You could explain all this by appealing to the ratios of the atoms that made them up and the basic properties of those atoms, okay? So Aristotle's familiar with this view, but he rejects it. He gives a number of arguments against atomism. We're not even going to go into that here because it is super complicated. Aristotle offers, in place of atoms, a theory of elements. He views matter as bottoming out in elements which themselves are characterized by properties, at least the terrestrial, that is the earthly elements, which are earth, air, fire, and water. They're characterized by basic properties of being dry, wet, hot, cold, okay? And so we have on Earth these four elements, earth, air, fire, water. That whole idea of the four elements has a long history. It's not that when ancient Greeks start thinking of elements, they immediately settle on four. We'll skip over all that here, though it is really quite fascinating. But so Aristotle understands everything around us that we see on Earth to be made out of compounds of these four elements, okay, which again are characterized by combinations, ratios of hot, cold, wet, dry. All right. Aristotle has some interesting things to say about the elements, right? So Aristotle, he is guided by empirical observation. There's no doubt about it. It's sometimes said today that Aristotle's not empirical at all. That's just completely not true. There's some physicists challenging that now. But one thing that I think we see Aristotle doing is he's looking around and he's saying, he's seeing that, if you just like look at the islands around Greece, it seems that, water tends to rest above earth. You can see this if you take a glass of water and throw some dirt into it, right? The dirt sinks. Certainly a stone sinks, right? So it seems that earth tends to go down. You might think of earth as heavier, right? It tends to go to go down. Water tends to go up, but air rests above the water. So you can think of air as lighter. And fire goes up in the air. When you light a candle, it kind of looks like the fire's going up in the air. So you might think of fire as lighter than air, right? And so we can characterize these four elements in terms of relative heaviness and lightness. And to be honest with you, it's so long since I've read Aristotle's physics. I got to be honest, I know definitely later thinkers characterize the elements and atoms in terms of relative weight, light, heavy, but I can't remember absolutely for certain if Aristotle does. I think he must have, but at any rate, we'll just do that here. So like fire's the lightest, air's a little heavier, water heavier, earth heaviest, right? So I'm pretty sure Aristotle actually uses heavy, light like that. One thing Aristotle definitely does for sure is he talks about these four elements having natural movements and natural places. So he thinks of our Earth as lying at the center of the universe, and the natural place of Earth, again, he must have actually used heavy light. The natural place of Earth, I'm guessing because of its heaviness, is to be at the very center of the universe. And he thought that the center of our Earth basically it's Earth, right? That's why we call it Earth, I guess, right? And on top of that's the seas, the water. So like the natural place of the water is to be on top of the earth. And then the natural place of the air is to be on top of that. And the natural place of the fire is to be on top of that. So these elements have natural places and they have natural movements. They want to move to their natural place, right? So if you throw a stone up in the air, it'll fall down to the ground because its natural place is under the air, under the water. So it'll move down to the ground. Okay, that'd be a natural motion. And he also thought that the natural motions of these elements were rectilineal. That is, they move in straight lines, right? Aristotle, I believe, again, it's been a while since I looked at his physics. I did good gobs of Aristotle when I was younger, but it's been a while since I've done the physics. But I believe Aristotle uses the term perhaps something like impulse, maybe, to refer to these natural motions. I know some later scholars criticized Aristotle for the idea that earth, air, fire, and water want to move to their natural places. They desire it. But he's not thinking like that. He's not thinking like that. He's not thinking that these things have minds like that, right? He's not doing it. If there's any language in his physics that seems to suggest that, we should remind ourselves that we still talk about things such as gravity and electrostatic forces in terms of like laws of it, or at least for electrostatics, we'll use, laws of attraction. I think sometimes we even apply that language to gravity. But when we talk about like charges attracting and repelling, we don't think that they're in love with one another and they hate one another. I mean, that's just a way overread a metaphor. Similarly with Aristotle, if he's talking about impulses and such, and I mean, he's certainly talking about natural motions. He's not attributing psychology to these things, right? It's just a metaphor. But again, you have the four elements. They do have natural places. They do have natural motions that lead them to those places if they're unimpeded, and they move in straight lines naturally, unless acted on otherwise, right? Okay, so when it gets to space, things get more interesting for Aristotle. He actually thinks that space is made out of a fifth element, the things in space. The sun, moon, and the stars, they're made out of a fifth element. And Aristotle's reasoning here seems to be, it's quite interesting, is that when you look up at the heavens, they seem to be circling us. If you take the Earth to be at the center of the universe, and the sun, the moon, and the stars to be orbiting us, well, their natural motion seems to be circular. They're moving, it looks tracing out circular paths. And actually we are tracing out a circular path around the sun, right? And the moon is tracing out a circular orbit around us. The planets in the solar system are tracing out, it's not really circular, it's elliptical. I mean, it's kind of like a squash circle, right? And it was our buddy Kepler who discovered that for us, during the heydays of the scientific revolution. So anyhow, but it's roughly circular, elliptical, roughly circular, right? That's how it looks to Earth, and that is what it is, except of course we're going around the sun, it's not going around us. But the point is, for Aristotle, it actually makes a lot of sense if you start from his starting points, right? That if the elements are characterized, earth, air, fire, and water are characterized presumably by heaviness and lightness, but also by, and going along with that, their natural positions and natural motions. And those are rectilineal, straight line, because again, when we drop a stone, it goes straight down, and we light a candle, the flame goes straight up. If when we look up in the heavens, everything's going around in a circle, okay, then it has to be made out of a fifth element. That seems to be how Aristotle reasons. And again, given his starting points, it's quite natural. Aristotle does not understand gravity. He does not understand inertia and such things in the way that we do, right? Universal gravitation is really discovered for the first time by Sir Isaac Newton, who died in, I believe, the beginning of the 1700s. Scientists have really only known about gravity for not even 350 years. Now, you did have folks like Galileo using the term gravitas for like heaviness in Latin, but Galileo didn't understand gravity either, right? Neither did Kepler. The earlier luminaries, if you will, bright lights of the scientific revolution, they didn't know about gravity, right? Kepler thought the tides were due to the moon exerting a magnetic force on the earth, which is quite interesting, but he didn't understand, what magnetism was. He didn't understand electromagnetism, and he didn't understand gravity. Galileo disagreed with Kepler. He thought that the tides were due solely to the revolution of the earth on its own axis. It was like, the spinning of the earth that generated the tides. Newton was really the first person that realized that the same, we'll call it force, that governs, my pocket knife when I drop it, and that is keeping the Earth around the sun, something Newton understood at the time. We're going around the sun, not vice versa. It's one and the same force that's actually responsible for all this on Earth and in space, one unifying force. And thus Newton kind of unified heaven and earth, if you want to put it that way, whereas Aristotle had separated them, because 4 elements down here and 1 up in space, and the one in space acts very differently than the one down here. The one in space doesn't interact with the one here, right? So anyhow, my sense is also, from the little I've read on this, that a lot of scholars did not follow Aristotle on the 5th element when it came to space. And certainly there were a lot of ancient Greeks before Aristotle that thought this stuff in space is made out of the same stuff on Earth. They would say that the sun is a stone or a fire or a fiery stone or something like that. But for Aristotle, no, it's not fire, right? Fire's here. It goes straight, right? The sun goes in a circle, then it can't be a fire, right? So anyhow, how is this relevant to the Paradiso? Well, first of all, in Canto 1, you're going to see Beatrice and Dante, and they're on Earth. And what they're going to do is ascend. They're going to ascend. And they're going to ascend to the planets and the sun and the stars. Of course, we know today that the sun is a star. Back then, it was not conceived such, right? It was not conceived in such a way. Just another quick comment on this, which is really interesting. Our word planet comes from a Greek term, means wanderer, because actually the planets trace out some pretty, their paths are actually quite erratic from Earth, as it turns out. And there are, ancient medieval people who were aware of this, right? But the stars, did not seem to be quite so erratic, and so their movements seem to be more regular, and so they were called the fixed stars. They were often called the fixed stars. So the idea is they are moving around the Earth, but they're fixed. They're more fixed than the planets, whose orbits can really be quite odd in some ways. Their orbits can be quite odd. All right, so to go back to the physics, maybe we'll go back to the astronomy in a bit. Aristotle, and I'm still a little foggy on Aristotle's use of this, right? Because I never really went super deep into his astronomy. But again, Aristotle's got these 4 elements, and fire's like the lightest, if he's using that light heavy terminology, and the fire definitely, its natural place is above the air. Aristotle seems to have thought that if you could, go up high enough, on the Earth, and he doesn't have a concept of the atmosphere and all that like we do, right? But if you went up high enough and you went toward the moon, you would see this ring of fire. Which maybe was invoked to explain all sorts of meteorological phenomena, right? That we still observe today. But at any rate, he thought there's this kind of ring of fire, right, around the Earth before you get to the moon. Well, in Canto 1, we're going to see Beatrice and Dante go to that ring of fire, and they're going to pass through that ring of fire before they pass on to the moon. Okay. Just another comment about this. So all of this should help you to understand what is all that fire stuff about in Canto 1, but also there's this discussion of Canto 1, discussion at the end of Canto 1 about the natural kind of law of thing, natural motions of thing, impulses of things, right? And that can seem kind of funny. And you might be sitting there reading it and saying, okay, so Dante's saying that the movements of plants and animals, the behavior of plants and animals is kind of dictated by the stars, or what the elements too. Yeah, again, the idea is these elements have these natural impulses, right? And then or impulses or motions, right? And the plants and animals that are constructed out of them, you're going to be able to explain their behavior, their properties, right? At least to some degree in terms of the elements that make them up, right? I don't want to really get into the weeds here, but Aristotle's explanations can be as top down as bottom up, and in some ways more top down than bottom up. But let's just kind of leave it at that. But one thing we need to say about this before we move on, right, is if you think back to Inferno, you think back to Limbo, where we encountered this guy Empedocles. And again, Empedocles is a pre-Socratic philosopher before Aristotle. He posits these two fundamental forces that drive everything in the cosmos: love and hate. And again, does he actually mean that, like bits of matter loved and hated one another? It might just really be a metaphor, though. Honestly, for Empedocles, who knows what was up with that dude? I haven't read enough of him, and he had some strange stuff. Maybe he actually did attribute some kind of psychology, to all these things out there in the world. But again, this language of like love and hate and attraction is really old. We still use it today, right? And when we talk about science, we find it natural to do that. Well, there's this idea in Judaism and Christianity that God created the cosmos out of love, and the whole cosmos loves God back. And everything that happens in the universe happens out of love. And you might remember back in Purgatorio, when Virgil's explaining sin, he's saying that sin is actually all motivated by love, because everything we do is motivated by love, right? And sin happens when we love things we shouldn't love. We treat as good things that aren't good at all, or we take things that are good and secondary goods, and we love them as primary goods when we shouldn't do that, or when we just fail to love a primary good as a primary good. So it's loving God too little, or putting other goods before God, or treating things that aren't good as good, period. So on Dante's view, all of our desires are motivated by love, but in this kind of loose way, we can't actually attribute love to everything in the cosmos, right? Because if everything's got these natural motions, or built out of things with these natural motions, even the mountains are made out of the elements, stones are made out of the elements, plants are made out of the elements, squirrels are made out of the elements, and these have these natural motions, which we could describe as involving impulses, which we could describe as them wanting to go certain places, and wanting as desiring as love, then actually everything responds to God in love, right? Let's actually bring Aristotle's astronomy into this a little more and then wrap this up. Okay, so if you look at Dante's astronomy, which comes out of Aristotle and Ptolemy, influenced by Macrobius's Dream of Scipio, and these Muslim scholars, right, including Alfraganus, I think was a major one, 9th century Persian scholar, maybe I think had a big impact on Dante. In the Middle Ages, they didn't know about all the planets that we know about today. Then they have debates over Pluto, right? But they didn't know about Neptune. They didn't know about Uranus. The planets they basically had were Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And that's reflected in a lot of cultures. It's reflected in various ways in their terms for those planets. Languages, they have their own terms for these planets, but once you get to the ones that are more recently discovered, often there's great similarity in their terms across languages, because they basically were scientific terms, discoveries that came out of modern science. So anyhow, Dante, yes, what are the planets he's aware of? Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, right? Now, he's also got the moon, he's also got the sun, and then he's also got the stars. Now, going back to the Ptolemaic Aristotelian system, that is a system Aristotle, the Ptolemy, and others built on, the idea here was that these moon, sun, planets, and stars were embedded in spheres. They were embedded in spheres. Now, there's a lot of debate about how literally these spheres were taken. Did people think that like Saturn was like literally embedded in a transparent crystal sphere, in the way you might think of like a gemstone being embedded in a glass ring? It seems like some people actually did take it that way. Others, there's some debate about whether they did. We're just going to use this language of the spheres, right? The idea is that the Earth is at the center, and then the moon is outside us in the first sphere. And then Mercury's outside of that in the second sphere. And then Venus in the third sphere, the Sun in the fourth, Mars in the fifth, Jupiter the sixth, Saturn the seventh. The eighth is the starry sphere, or the sphere of the fixed stars. That's where all the stars are. And then outside of that is the crystalline sphere, or the prima mobile, right? The first moved. And then we have what you might call the highest heaven, the Empyrean. So let me just say a little more about this. So the first sphere's got the moon. Again, so there is a heavenly body there, right? There's the moon, okay? Then we have the second sphere's got Mercury. That's got a heavenly body, Mercury, and so on up through Saturn. These each have one heavenly body, right? We call some of these planets, we call our moon the moon. Of course, we got planets that have moons. Like Mars has got 2 moons, and Jupiter's got, what, over 80 that we know of, maybe even more than that. We keep discovering new ones. I don't know, for over 100 now. It's really kind of astounding. But anyhow, the way that Dante is thinking about it is each of these first spheres up to the 8th, it's got one heavenly body in it. When you get to the starry sphere, it's got tons in them, tons of different stars. Well, what about the 9th, the one beyond that, the crystalline sphere? It doesn't have any heavenly body in it at all, right? There's no stars in it, and there's no planets in it. Right, so what's up there? Well, let's wait till we get there. All right, I'll say a little bit about it here. But Dante will kind of, there's like a matter to these planets, right, when he's going through them, right? I mean, the description of the moon is really interesting when he and Beatrice ascend to it, right? When we get up to the crystalline sphere, we will see some stuff. Kind of like physically type stuff. But what is it? And are we meant to interpret it literally? We'll wait for that. We also have angels and saints, you know, as we're going up through these spheres. God, there's a really great reveal about all of this. I'm not going to spoil now. We'll probably get to it in class on Monday, right? But it's a little bit more about the crystalline sphere. Again, the crystalline sphere, the prima mobile, the first moved, right? It doesn't have any stars in it. It doesn't have planets in it, right? So what does it have in it? Well, let me say, for just kind of, you know, actually, I don't know if I really want to say much more about it. What do I have to say about it that you need for Cantos 1 and 2? I'll say in Canto 2, you're going to see Dante talk as if in the crystalline sphere, you have all the angelic intelligences, the angels, kind of there in a unified way. Basically, these spheres, each of them is going to be governed by angels. It was a common view in the Middle Ages under the influence like Christianity, that these spheres each was moved. What's moving the spheres? What's making, you know, the sun, moon, planet, stars go around the earth? Well, they're in these spheres. Well, what's moving the spheres? Angels, right? Well, one angel or many angels. The way that Dante is going to describe this in Paradiso is each of these spheres is moved by one order of angels. There's going to be 9 orders of angels. So we're going to have an order of angels, a whole order of angels moving each sphere, right? But at the same time, it's like all these angels are kind of united in some way in the outermost sphere, the crystalline sphere. And I'm just trying to decide how much I want to share, because I don't want to spoil too much of 2. Okay, I will say a little bit about this, right? Because I think this maybe really need to help understand too. Dante's going to get into a discussion of with Beatrice over the nature of moon spots. The idea when you look up at the moon, some parts, you know, look brighter, look darker, right? This is something that was very interesting to medieval ancient people. How do you explain it? Lots of myths about that, right? So Dante's going to get into a discussion of that with Beatrice. It might seem kind of cold and uninteresting and passé. I don't want to say too much about it now, but I'll just encourage you. But it's actually really cool and interesting, and it really goes to the heart of how Dante understands the relationship between philosophy and theology, between, you might say, science and religion. It's really interesting. It also sheds some really interesting light on the state of scientific thinking at the time, which is really quite interesting, really quite cool, right? There's some reference to experiments, even some really good experiments in the text. It's really quite interesting. I'll just say I've read a lot on the history of science and on the history of experiments, and I never see these historians of science talk about Dante's Paradiso at all, and I think they really ought to do so, because man, is Paradiso super interesting on this stuff. So anyhow, but Beatrice, not to spoil too much, but Beatrice's final explanation of moonspots, because Dante's not going to be able to understand it because he's relying just on natural philosophy, he's relying just on his senses and his natural reason, that is like his reason without the help of theology, right? Dante, it turns out, can't really understand the moonspots, and Beatrice is going to say that to understand them, yes, you got to use your senses, you got to use your logic, but you also have to use theology, and you have to bring in the angels, right? And she's going to say that in a way that is similar to how the one soul, the idea here in this, for Dante's, we got one soul that actually does a lot of different things in our body. The soul's what keeps us alive, but we have a lot of different biological functions and activities, right? So our one soul does a lot of different things in our body, that these orders of angels, yes, they're different orders of angels, but they're also united in a way that when they kind of flood down from the crystalline sphere, the prima mobile, the first moved, and they flood into the other spheres, they flood into the universe, right? The lower parts of the universe, the cosmos, they end up actually, it turns out that, well, in the sphere of the fixed stars, some stars will glow more brightly than others. Some will glow different colors than others. Some seem to have different sizes, different shapes. That'll be due to like the one united angelic intelligence, which again fans out into 9 orders, each of which contains many different angels. But it's like that one united intelligence kind of animates those stars in different ways. It's like our soul animates our body in different ways, right? And the planets, of course, and the sun and the moon, they seem to have different properties. Well, this is because of the way that the angelic intelligence, the angels, are kind of flooding them and animating them in different ways. And she'll use that to explain the moonspots in a way which will also make an interesting reference to the sparkle in somebody's eye. I don't want to say too much more about that. We'll leave that for a class, but just a few loose ends here to tie up. Again, astral forces, astrological forces. If we have these angels coming from the crystalline sphere into the starry sphere, the 9th sphere into the 8th sphere, and already in the starry sphere, the fixed star sphere, the 8th sphere, we're seeing that some of these stars glow brighter than others, different colors than others, larger, smaller than others. Then we see these angels are making things. They're making the stars different from one another. And then and it's the angels are making the stars like this. And then those stars, together with the angels at the lower spheres, they're impacting everything at the spheres below them, which then impacts things on the earth, right? So then this goes back to astral influences and free will. I think just one other thing I want to say to wrap all this up, 2 things actually to address. So if you look at the map of Dante's Paradiso, in our edition of Hollander, so it looks like this is page Roman 30, you see the earth at the bottom with the 9 spheres I mentioned, and then at the top is the Empyrean, and to the left we see the stadium, and to the right we see the rows of paradise. I don't want to say anything about the stadium or the rows at this point, but you might wonder, what about the Empyrean? Are there 9 heavens or are there 10? Well, the idea here is, Hollander puts it on Roman 22 of his introduction, right? So I'm quoting now, strictly speaking, Dante's physical universe contains only these 9 spheres. Surmounting it, existing beyond time and space, yet containing all space and time, is the home of God, the angels, and the souls of the saved, with seats reserved for those few yet to come. This place is known as the Empyrean. Now that does kind of spoil the reveal, but I don't think it's actually probably done that for any of you. But the idea here is that The Empyrean, you might call it the highest heaven. It's actually outside all these spheres. These spheres are in space-time. These spheres are the cosmos. These spheres are a part of our physical reality. I mean, we could see Jupiter at night sometimes, right? The idea is, like heaven, the highest heaven, it's beyond all that, but somehow contains all of that. And that's where God really dwells, and that's called the Empyrean. So, one last comment, something I'm really not sure about myself, because it's been a couple years since I read Paradiso, and I don't think I was actually all that focused on this issue the last couple of times I read it. I think I kind of slipped my radar. But if Aristotle believes that everything in space is made out of these nine, is made out of, I was just realizing there's actually a third thing I need to address before we finish. If Aristotle thinks everything out in space, and these nine spheres, at least as are represented in Dante, if Aristotle thinks that, like, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the stars are made out of this fifth element, does Dante also think that? Does he think that's all made out of the fifth element? I don't remember. I honestly don't remember. And I'm not sure if it's ever really made explicit in Dante. And believe it or not, I pretty much never use AI. But I put it in AI this morning just to see what would happen. Does Dante's Paradiso, is it committed to Aristotle's fifth element? And it told me yes, but then when I looked at what it gave me, it was totally garbled. It made no sense. It totally violated all the fundamental principles of Aristotle's fifth element, which, if anything, would point to no. I mean, Dante doesn't think that, but I don't really trust AI for these kind of things. I don't know. I tried to do a little bit of research on this, and some of the books I had at home, I didn't have enough time. I really couldn't find anything firm on that. I can already see some things in Canto 2 that might be pointing to, yes, Dante does think, the moon up, all of that is made out of a fifth element. I'm not sure. We'll try to keep an eye on it. It might be, I don't know if Dante really takes a firm position on it. One related issue with all of that is that it's a little unclear to me exactly how Aristotle conceived of the moon. So Aristotle definitely thinks to, like, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, definitely the stars, he definitely thinks that stuff's made out of the fifth element, definitely. The moon, I'm not quite sure, because I think it was understood in Aristotle's time that the moon, it doesn't look perfect, and the idea was this fifth element is perfect, and those planets and the sun, and the stars, they're all perfect. They're without any kind of blemish. By the way, it was huge in the scientific revolution when Galileo, who did not invent the telescope, had heard of it, and without seeing it, built his own, and then rapidly increased its powers of magnification when he started seeing sunspots, and he actually looked at the moon. He started pointing his telescope at the moon and the sun and other things, and recognized the sun's definitely not perfect. The sun's definitely not perfect, right? That was actually kind of a huge blow to the astronomy of the time. He also looked at the moon, but my sense is by that time, by Galileo's time, even though a lot of people still believed in this Aristotelian Ptolemaic model, they kind of knew that the moon wasn't perfect. I mean, Aristotle must have been able to see that, or did he? I mean, he must have been able to see that the moon doesn't look perfectly smooth. But did he really think it's imperfect? And so the moon wasn't made out of the fifth element. It's just stuff above the moon, or the moon somehow got contaminated by fire. But how could it if the fifth element doesn't interact with terrestrial elements? Or was it just, he thought, atmospheric effects? I don't know. And actually, every once in a while, I do actually try to do a little bit of research on Aristotle and the moon. And it's kind of maddening because all the articles and books I've looked at, and it's a considerable number, it almost seems like they've been written in a way to skirt the issue on purpose. It's like, why can't people who are experts on Aristotle's astronomy, give straighter answers to all this? At some point, I'm just going to have to write some people who do specialize in this and try and get answers from them. But anyhow, I'm not exactly sure how Aristotle conceived the moon vis-a-vis the rest of the heavenly bodies. I'm not sure quite how Dante viewed the moon, or even if he believed in the fifth element at all. Just last thing to say before we wrap up, Aristotle, his view of how everything in the universe moves is really kind of complicated. I'm going to tell you the standard interpretation. It's been standard for a long time. This is probably how Dante read it. And I'll just mention there are some scholars like Sarah Brody that do question at least parts of this, and I have not yet had time to really go into their work. But the idea is that Dante does believe in one main God, right? And we sometimes call the prime mover, right? The PM, or unmoved mover. And the way it's often thought of is his God, his main God, is intelligent, but it's not really a personal God, right? That his God is not aware of us. His God doesn't answer prayers. His God doesn't hear prayers. His God is not even aware that we exist. His God then is not all-knowing. Actually, his God knows extremely little, right? On the standard interpretation. The standard interpretation, his God basically is pure mind that contemplates itself for all eternity, right? It's contemplation whose only object is its own contemplation. It contemplates its own contemplation. So it's not aware of us at all. There's actually some interesting parallels with the way a lot of early Hindu texts, understand Brahman, and the way some later Hindus understand Brahman, which we won't explore here. But then you could ask, okay, so if his main God doesn't know we exist, his main God doesn't create. That's right. For Aristotle, the universe is eternal. It has no beginning and no end. I still hear even scientists, like well-trained scientists, when they're talking about Darwin, they'll contrast him with Aristotle and say that Aristotle thought God designed everything. Aristotle's God designs nothing. That is not true. Aristotle's God did not design horses, right? Aristotle's God doesn't even know horses exist. He has no awareness of horses on the standard interpretation. Horses have always existed, right? And they will always exist. Aristotle seems to think species are eternal, going back and going forward, right? But his God is still responsible for everything in the universe. And like, well, how could that possibly be if his God doesn't create everything and doesn't even know about it? Standard interpretation, the idea is once you get to those heavenly bodies outside of the main God, which are themselves gods, right? Aristotle seems to think the stars and, the sun, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Mercury, I don't know, the sun, the moon, I don't quite know this beyond the moon is, those things are gods and their intelligences, right? And they are responding to the prime mover. How? They are in love with the prime mover. They're in love with the prime mover. The prime mover is not in love with them, does not know they exist, but they are in love with him. They honor him, they value him, and in particular, they honor and they value and they love his contemplation, her contemplation, its contemplation. They love its contemplation, and that they try to imitate its contemplation as much as possible. And so what do? They trace out circular motions to imitate the motion of thought, the natural motion of thought, which Aristotle said is circular. Right? And so through their love for God, the gods that are the stars and the sun and the planets, maybe the moon, I don't know, are imitating the prime mover without its knowledge by tracing out these circular motions with the lower spheres following the higher spheres. So that means everything happening down to Mercury and I guess to the moon is all a response to the highest God. And then the idea is things on Earth are actually imitating those lower spheres. So maybe the seasons come from imitating the lower spheres, which are imitating higher spheres, which are imitating the highest spheres, which are imitating the prime mover. And maybe the eternality of the species too is a form of this. And maybe in a way, everything on Earth is actually responding in a way out of love to the prime mover, but the prime mover doesn't create them and the prime mover doesn't even know they're there. Dante's going to pick up on this big time because it gives you a nice way to develop the idea that it's not just us, but that and the angels, but that everything in the universe actually is motivated out of love, and that everything in the whole universe is driven by love for God, though that love can be highly distorted in Lucifer and fallen angels and in ourselves. Okay, all right, one final comment to wrap this all up. The crystalline sphere is the fastest moving. The Empyrean doesn't move. It's outside of space and time, so there's no motion, right? And that is not an Aristotelian idea at all, right? There's nothing outside the universe for Aristotle, right? His prime movers and his part of the universe, right? But we're in a Christian setting here and medieval Catholic setting. The idea here is like the highest heaven where God is outside the universe, so it doesn't move because movement's relative to space. Space is the physical universe, right? The crystalline sphere, the idea is moves the fastest, maybe the greatest love for God and the greatest vision of God. And the eighth sphere is a little slower, seventh a little slower, down to the first sphere, right? So this will help explain the references in the first couple of cantos to the fastest sphere, the sphere closest to it, right? That should all, I hope, help you out quite a lot. Actually, okay, one last comment. A lot of Christians today actually would say that heaven is going to be on earth. The last image in the book of Revelation is a new Jerusalem coming down from earth to heaven. It's going to be a renewed earth. We're not actually going to go up in the stars and beyond the stars. Jesus is going to come back and he's going to fix this place up. Thank you so much for hanging out. See you all soon.